get started. So good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to welcome you today to the panel on ensuring access to justice and ending gender-based violence in Canada. This event is co-organized by the Canadian Beijing Plus 30 Network and the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, also known as CRIAW-ICREF. I'm Joanna Lund, and I'm the project coordinator at CRIAW-ICREF, coordinating CRIA's work as the Secretariat of the Beijing Network. I'm joined by other CRIAW-ICREF staff members, Melissa and Tiffany, and Jackie Neopol, who will be moderating today's panel. Before I begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are here today in New York City on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Lenape peoples who have cared for this region since time immemorial. We would also like to recognize that CRIAW-ICREF respectfully acknowledges our presence and work on Indigenous territories across Canada. We stand with Indigenous people across Turtle Island in dismantling colonialism and ending inequality in all its forms and its intersections with racism and sexism. So just a little bit about the Canadian Beijing Plus 30 Network and CRIA as a co-sponsor of this event. The Canadian Beijing Plus 30 Network is a grassroots network of 70 plus feminist and equality-seeking organizations that monitors progress on the Beijing Platform for Action in Canada and works in Canada on women's rights and gender equality issues. CRIAW-ICREF is the current secretariat of the Beijing Network. Founded in 1976, CRIAW-ICREF is a national women's rights organization dedicated to feminist research and action on women's rights in Canada. The discussion today will be moderated by Jackie Neopol, Executive Director of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. Since 2013, Jackie has been involved in CRIAW-ICREF's research and action on many feminist issues, including public services, the rise of regressive movements, and creating tools and resources for applying feminist intersectionality to research and action. After the discussion, we will open the floor for a Q&A session, inviting you, our participants and allies, to pose questions for our panelists. Thank you again for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists. And I'll now pass over to Jackie. Just let me know if you
Yeah, I'm going to try this. Hello? 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 Yeah. Can you hear me? Is that working through the? Okay. They said, okay, excellent.
Oh, really? Oh,
okay. Thanks, Joanna. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So, a systemic analysis to ensuring access to justice. This is a big topic. As feminists, we all know that there are so many interrelated and connected layers to a conversation about justice. Access to justice can be viewed as showing up to court and accessing a lawyer, sure, but also the ability to assert, understand our legal rights, and use the justice system to defend our rights and ourselves. Relatedly, what about when your legal system is unjust? Do you have justice even if you have access to the system? How do we as feminists advocate for necessary law reform and participate in lawmaking processes to change the justice system? What about women living injustice in their daily lives due to persistent intersecting inequality? The gender pay gap, poverty, violence. What about neoliberal governments that prop up corporations and value profit over people? Or implement austerity measures that dismantle our social protections and public services? Is this a just society? Do women in their diversity have justice? And then it brings us right back to what kind of impact do structural inequalities have on our ability to access the formal justice system? Justice in all of its forms is central in our work as feminists. And we have an awesome panel here today to unpack the interconnected elements in the feminist quest for justice. Panelists will share their experiences on advocacy, service provision, and policy reform, and will examine the persistent challenges and, of course, identify emerging opportunities for change. So we have, I'll just start introducing here. So we have Emily Coyle. She is the co-executive director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, CAPES. She's been in this role since 2020, and she co-leads CAPES' work in supporting criminalized and marginalized women and gender diverse people focusing on advocacy, public education, and systemic reform to address the mass incarceration and marginalization of vulnerable populations, particularly Indigenous women and gender diverse people in federal prisons. CAIFS has been the leading national organization supporting criminalized women since 1978. Next, beside Emily, we have Deepa. Deepa Mattu is the Executive Director of the Barbara Schiffler Commemorative Clinic, BSCC. Deepa oversees multiple departments and directs the clinic's intervention and advocacy efforts. Deepa has trained thousands of service providers to support forced marriage survivors, racialized non-status women, and clients navigating immigration law. BSCC offers trauma-informed legal services and representation, counseling, and multilingual interpretation, and drives system transformation to support women and gender diverse people who have experienced violence. Beside her is Candice Shaw. Candice Shaw is the Executive Director of the Ending Sexual Violence Association of Canada, ESVA. Previously, Candice was the Executive Director of the Ottawa Rape Crisis Centre, and prior to that was the Director for Violence Prevention and MMIWG2S Plus at the Native Women's Association of Canada. ESVA is a national nonprofit organization that works collaboratively with its member organizations and others to provide a unified pan-Canadian voice on the issue of sexual violence. Beside Candice is Sharon D'Souza. Sharon D'Souza was elected National President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada in May 2024. She previously served as PSAC's National Executive Vice President, a position she held since 2020. Sharon has broken barriers at every stage of her activism, becoming the first racialized woman in PSAC's history to serve as both National President and National Executive Vice President. Formed in 1966, the Public Service Alliance of Canada is one of Canada's largest unions, representing over 245,000 workers in every province and territory in Canada and in locations around the world. So we're going to start this powerhouse panel here. We're going to start by having each panelist speak to accessing justice from their organization's perspective, the areas they're working on. What does it look like, access to justice? What are some of the biggest obstacles, barriers, and other issues that you see in your work? So they'll have about 7 to 8 minutes each to speak to that, and then we'll be moving further the conversation to action in areas where we can work to improve and areas where there may be opportunities to change some of the injustice that we're seeing. So I'll just turn it over to you, Emily.
Okay, great. So you can all hear me? Okay. So the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies works alongside and with criminalized women and gender diverse people. And it's really important that I state that at the outset, because we're not an organization at the national level that does service provision. We do systemic change work, we do advocacy with the government, we do coalition building with some of these wonderful people here. We really are trying to change the narrative. We're trying to talk about what are the ways in which women and gender diverse people come to the injustice system, as many of them call it, and why are there persistently the same people that we see who are falling behind and unfortunately cyclically involved with the criminal legal system. And so criminalized women in Canada overwhelmingly come from the communities who experience poverty, homelessness, disability, trauma, and systemic racism, especially racism associated with colonization in Canada. And so most often survival is the reason that people become connected to the justice system. And I'm super excited that we were asked to participate in this panel because criminalization is an overlooked aspect of intersectionality in our work. I know not yours, and not yours, and probably not yours, but often when we're talking about systemic inequality, we forget about the ways in which criminalized women are often experiencing stigma from the very feminist organizations that they're seeking support from. And so in Canada, how many of you are from Canada here? Like everybody? Whoa! Okay, we're all from Canada. So all the Canadians probably know, because some of you have been to my presentations before, but we have a really, really horrible problem in Canada, and that we incarcerate Indigenous women more than we incarcerate anybody else. So 50% of the people who are incarcerated in the prisons designated for women in Canada are Indigenous. That's half. And so we're really falling short of our obligations there. And inside those prisons, we have practices that keep Indigenous women and Black women, racialized women in prison for longer and in conditions that are harsher. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I want to move to the point around access to justice and what it means for our organization. And it's not limited to access to lawyers or to courts. It means ensuring that criminalized women and gender diverse people, those who are incarcerated, can live free from discrimination, violence, and structural inequality. It means that they're treated with dignity and with humanity, especially inside the prisons. It means having basic needs met: housing, income security, health care, mental health support, so that survival is not criminalized. And it means removing systemic barriers, which is why organizations like ours are so important. We talk a lot about, the service provision, but we don't talk a lot about what it takes to move systems, right? To change systems. And we have to do that. We have to look, way far in advance and think, how are my small actions going to change the systems that are impacting all of us? Because, as I said yesterday, the liberation of people who are in prison is tied up with my liberation as well. And we also have to ensure that the voices and experiences of criminalized women and gender diverse people are the ones that are driving the policy and system transformation that we're talking about. So that's access to justice for us. Thanks.
So thank you, Emily. So I'm from Schiffler Commemorative Clinic, and the clinic has been in existence for 40 years, and it is named after a woman, Barbara Schleifer. She was a lawyer, and unfortunately on her night to the call to the bar ceremony, when she was going back home in the city of Toronto, she was assaulted and killed. So her friends came together to create this clinic in 1980. I know, I should have given a trauma warning. So the clinic started as a holistic service because our grandmothers, I call them, knew that access to justice is holistic. She was a feminist. She wanted to do social justice lawyering, and people who came together to create the clinic right at its foundation understood that access to justice actually goes far beyond law. Survivors, women and gender diverse people, don't experience harm in legal silos, so justice can't be delivered in a legal silo as well. So for us, the access to justice means at the onset doing an assessment and checking and asking, are you safe? What is the level of risk that you're involved in? What is your goal? What is the level of trust that you have of the system? Does the system actually believe you? Can you actually engage in the system without any system harming you? Can you actually start any legal process safely without getting into a process where you will be further traumatized? So our work is intentionally integrated. We provide trauma-informed legal services across family, immigration, criminal, sexual assault, administrative law, including human rights claims, alongside counseling, housing, and court support, along with professional interpretation and coordinated case management. If you're getting tired of listening to the long list, yes, it is long. And along with doing all of this service provision, where we serve around 18,000 people a year, we also do system transformation work. Because we believe if we don't do both things together, we will be cogs in the wheels of the system. And we want to move, and we want to get moving and collaborating. So, interpretation for us is one of those pieces that I always talk about. So if you hear me talk about that, you will understand that for us it is central to the access itself, because we don't believe interpretation is just language access. It is actually access to the system. People who don't speak language in which they understand and express themselves, they cannot tell their stories in their words and not make any informed choices. The justice system, the way it is designed, gives them a very discounted version of the system when they don't give them access to language. What have we done because system keeps failing our survivors we work with. What have we done in last few years? I think I'm taking a stock of last 1 decade. We have created innovative services. So we have a project called And Me Too, which is designed for precariously, And Me Too, you can see this goof, right? Like what was And Me Too? It is people who are precariously employed with precarious immigration status, having no human resources to complain to about sexual harassment that they experience. What have been able to achieve? We have been able to achieve compensation for survivors who work in people's houses, who work without status, who work in jobs which are gig economy jobs. We have a criminalization and survivorship project. What are we doing in that project? We're providing services and advocacy for survivors who are criminalized in the system. We have It's My Choice project. We have a clinic based out of Toronto in an urban center. Our lawyers in It's My Choice actually go out to rural community to provide services to clients where they are located. We have a case manager who works with a very small group of clients, like very, very small group with very high risk and high need, so that they don't go through a revolving door in our system where they go to one agency to another agency to another agency. So we have tried to close that revolving door that gets created. The challenge is that everything that we are trying to do is rooted very much about the choices people can make with dignity and agency in a system which is inherently broken, based off colonial legacy, very Anglo-Saxon. So it's like, you're flying the plane, but you're also fixing the plane at the same time. And I'm hoping that we will go into that a little bit more deeply in the next question. But the question was, what is access to justice for us? It is about choice, it is about agency, it is about dignity, and not just about legal outcomes, but the respect and honest dignity that people should get walking through that system. You do. You do. Here.
Oh, you got one. Okay.
Yeah, it's going to sound very similar. It's like we wrote it together.
Yeah.
It's very layered. I'm Candace Shaw, the Executive Director of the Ending Sexual Violence Association of Canada, and I really appreciate being here with my colleagues and being able to speak to a lot of these layered themes. So actually a lot of the legwork has been done by my colleagues here, so it might mean that I'm able to be a little bit brief, although that's fair. I also appreciate the land acknowledgement that was given at the outset. Thank you so much, Joanna, for that on behalf of CRIAW. So the Ending Sexual Violence Association of Canada is based in Ottawa on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe people. And as already noted, we are here on the unsurrendered territory of the Lenape people. Interestingly enough, just a side anecdote and then I'll get into it, but Manhattan actually means the island of many hills. And I don't know if anyone does a lot of walking around the island. From the outside, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But walking the 30 some odd blocks, because I love to walk, from East Village where I'm staying to getting here, you definitely feel the hills. So all this to say, and I can see people are really warm too, so maybe you all were walking before you got here, but it is also very warm. So with the Ending Sexual Violence Association of Canada, it's worth noting that we had actually refined our mandate to center on sexual violence in the last year. In our networks, we have over 100 sexual violence associations and crisis centers across the country, coast to coast to coast. How that's represented is through our memberships that are the provincial and territorial members who work with these on-the-ground community centers and crisis centers that address survivors who've experienced sexual violence. So the reason why we shifted our mandate to centering on sexual violence is because there wasn't a national voice, not for a very long time. And there wasn't one that really centered on focusing on survivors, trauma-informed supports, and talking about not only the service delivery to survivors, but also talking about the systemic change. When you don't have, like some of my colleagues have mentioned, when you don't have that national voice, the systemic change work becomes either something done off the side of the desk, if you can, or it gets lost altogether, and it's about service delivery and reactivity. And so the systemic focus here across this panel is essential and is one that I will speak to in the work that we do across our sector. It's worth noting that sexual violence is on the rise across Canada. It is actually, based on self-reports, very much on the rise, especially, and we're hearing about it in the news, Epstein files, and of course, the Hockey Canada trial, we know, we could go on. It is also one of the most underreported crimes in Canada. So this is kind of speaking to that gap in justice, right? So we're talking about, here we are, we haven't had a national voice until about 5 years ago, and we really just refined about a year ago. So what does access to justice look like for ESPA Canada? As my colleagues have said, it's more than just entering a courtroom. And in fact, when that courtroom and the system set up around it are not working for survivors, it leads us to a bigger question. For us, it's about prevention. So one, prevention from violence happening in the first place. And how we do that is working with these 100+ organizations, civil society across the country to collect data, to inform policy, to work on legislative change, but also to coordinate our sector across the community organizations, provincial territorial associations, and at the national level. But it's also about working across national landscapes like this in these conversations and working in partnership together to be able to speak to the systems that need to change. When we are also talking about prevention, it's worth noting here, survivors, I use that term a lot, but I do want to really emphasize, I'm not talking about a monolith. I'm talking about, statistically speaking, women, trans women, members of the LGBTQ+ communities. We are talking about people who are actively targeted for violence, not vulnerable. And I think that's a really important distinction, because we're talking about the systems that leave people without support and resources. And it's about power relationships. Further, access to justice for ESPA Canada is about prevention of further harm. So what that means is being able to address harm once it's happened and prevent it from happening again. And that really speaks to the work that we do with our members of our society, of our community-based programs, is to be able to address sexual violence as it's happened and ensuring that they have the resource, the data, the policy, and the voice at national tables to create that systemic change. It means about also ensuring that the systems that are set up to support those who've experienced harm don't also cause harm to survivors. And I think that's a narrative that we're talking more about. So I'll leave it here for now and pass it over to my colleague.
Thank you so much. Just to let you know, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, also known as PSAC, we have about over 245,000 members coast to coast to coast and internationally. What you may not know is, in terms of demographics, over 60% self-identify as women. Now, what's further interesting is when we look at our membership and we look at self-ID, the majority of them have an intersectional identity. So to say that our membership is diverse is an understatement. But they also have families, and they have friends, and they live in communities, and they're interconnected. And we recognize that. We recognize our members are a whole other ecosystem of survival, right? They look at the union, but they also have their community, their faith base, and they're interconnected. But what is amazing is our history. For those of you who do not know, our members in the 80s, these were women in clerical positions. They were underpaid, and they've been underpaid for a very long time. And what they decided was enough is enough. And the union, which was male dominated, white male, able-bodied dominated, was trying to pressure them into a certain manner. And they said, we've had enough. They got up and they walked out. And this started one of the largest strikes in Canada's history for those clerical workers. These were women taking their fight. And in turn, the union actually listened and launched a pay equity complaint. It took them 19 years to take the largest employer in Canada, Treasure Board, to court, and they won, and it was the largest settlement ever. So when we look at access to justice, for us, it's not just about our members. It's about building a society where women do not have to fight to be heard, believed, or protected. And it's not just about responding to harms women face. We also must address the systems that cause them, because true justice is about transforming the structures that create inequality, not just managing their consequences. And that means taking a proactive action centered those who are most valued to achieve truly equitable justice. And so when we're looking at justice, whose terms are we talking about? Because let's be honest, our judicial system is based on a patriarchal model, right? It's not based on it from a women-centered lens. And we have to recognize it must go beyond a one-size-fits-all model, a cookie-cutter approach, and it must meet the needs of all women, and that means intersectional identities must be part of the access. And so we also have to recognize that we have to fight for safer workplaces, and we need to be trauma informed, as my previous colleague mentioned. It's about also having equitable systems, and I'm not going to be speaking just from saying from the outside. I'm also talking about within the labor movement, because we have to recognize the labor movement has also been built on this patriarchal structure, and we have to change our processes, and we can't be, looking at whether it's the federal government, other employers, or even society as a whole in the systems without having that lens upon us. And so it means centering the voices of women and workers who live these challenges every day. And every day is a unique experience, and we have to acknowledge that. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really good framing, and it's just showing the complexity of what access to justice looks like, and what kind of systemic change, how deep this goes. So I guess the next thing that we want to talk about a bit more is what are some of the biggest obstacles and barriers that you see in your work? What are those exactly? So we started to frame it out, flying an airplane, fixing it is a big problem. But what are some of those obstacles? I'll pass it to you, Emily.
Okay. I have my notes here, and then I was just thinking, we are living in an era of, I was just reflecting on your comment about the patriarchy and sort of the patriarchy creating the legal system. And actually the patriarchy created a lot of other systems, a lot of the systems that we're living with, not just the legal system. And it strikes me that we're living in a time that's extremely tough on crime and is meeting some of the biggest issues that face women with a very carceral lens, right? So it's saying, okay, we have a big issue of sexual violence in our communities, we have a big issue of femicide, we have a great big issue around gender-based violence, and so our country is saying we're gonna meet those challenges, and by our country I mean our government, we're gonna meet those challenges by increasing criminalization. We're going to have new legislation like Bill C-16, Bill C-14, Bill C-12, that looks at criminalizing immigration, criminalizing gender-based violence, criminalizing femicide, and bringing back some of the things that we had worked hard to get rid of under the past Liberal government, like mandatory minimum penalties. Because we know from decades of research that these things don't actually stop the issues that we are facing in our communities. They make them worse, and especially worse for Indigenous women and gender diverse people, for Black women, for people who are living with disabilities, for people who are living in poverty, and all the people who are living all of those things all at once. And so I think that is kind of the biggest obstacle that we're facing right now, is this carceral response to the issues that we are identifying in our communities as pre-existing and getting worse and worse. But I know we're gonna get to like how we can address those. We have a lot of examples in Canada. We have the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. We have the recommendations from a commission called the Mass Casualty Commission. We have the Renfrew Inquiry. Like, there's so many ways that we could be addressing it if we actually took the time, because it's gonna take a lot of time, and it's gonna take a lot of work for us to actually do it, instead of just saying, you know what, we've criminalized femicide, we've made it a first-degree murder, and now we're gonna wipe our hands of it, and that's gender-based violence, done, right? Which we know it's not. And so the hard part for us is the stigma attached to criminalization, because once you go to prison, you're deemed to be bad. I mean, how many of us grow up with the propaganda that, you know, prisons are bad, where bad people go, and everybody else is good? And I mean, it's quite obvious to everybody in this room that there are a lot of people who've done a lot of harm in this world who are not in prison. And there are a lot of people who, for whatever circumstances in their lives have tried to survive, are now in prison, right? And so I think about my colleague Sherry, who has a life sentence. She's an Indigenous woman. She grew up in the north end of Winnipeg. She grew up with a grandparent who had been in residential school. Her mom died when she was 6 months old. Her dad wasn't around. Her grandparents were struggling through what it meant to be a survivor of residential schools, and they didn't have a lot of capacity for all the children that they were taking care of. And she and her friends would go from house to house wherever there was food. Like, that's what they were looking for, because they were trying to feed themselves. And then of course from that, you know, became shoplifting, became, you know, interactions with the criminal system, until eventually at age 17, they were holding up with a gun. She didn't have it, a store, because they were trying to get money. And along the way, and I asked these questions, what could we have done all along that way to invest in the communities to ensure that that moment didn't happen, where somebody actually lost their life? You know, and she didn't do it. She was a 17-year-old girl who was caught up in this, but she went to jail, and she was given a life sentence. And she will forever be on parole because of that, as a baby, as a 17-year-old. I say that because I have a 21-year-old, and I'm like, oh my God, now you're still a baby. So there's just so many ways that we could be working at the outset to invest in the communities and make sure that these horrible things don't happen, the prevention happens, but all we're doing is responding. And it takes a lot more effort, but I'm so heartened by the fact that all the work that we're doing is about community and response and building that up. And so in the face of all this tough on crime, there's a lot of really good things happening, which I know we'll get to later. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. I have to say that I'm feeling a little bit of a deja vu, because I've done so many conversations with Emily, and I'm going to the next 2 days in the similar kind of setting. So
We have two more.
I'm like two more to go, right? So in terms of one of the biggest, there are lots of barriers, and we have talked about the barriers and the obstacles to the access to justice. But if I had to think of one which is biggest in terms of, and everything that my colleagues have said here is on point. But I have been thinking about this for a long time. I've been doing it for quite some time now, and I feel like it's the jurogenic harm, which is the harm that is caused by the legal system and the justice system itself. So what is that? It's the discrimination, it's the bias, it's the assumption. So in case of the criminalization piece that Emily talks about so eloquently, it is when someone is trying to access safety, and they try to get someone to actually help them in a situation of harm, and they are experiencing harm. So in case of a mandatory charging, that call is made, and the intervention results in either the person, in our case a lot of women and gender diverse people experiencing criminalization, or the family experiencing criminalization, leading to the if the family is on a precarious immigration status, the entire clan getting criminalized. So that gyrogenic harm that happens in the moment when someone has tried to actually access safety. Another example, a woman who starts a family court case, makes an application to actually get parenting time for her children, and next thing she knows, she's labeled as, you're a high conflict individual. You just don't want to cooperate with the system. So if you don't want to cooperate with the system, then you're labeled as a high conflict, and because all you're trying to do is access those same children they were already living with. But now, because you're saying that I'm wanting to have better access because this person is abusive, my co-parent is abusive, whatever kind of parent that person is, you are seen as, oh, you're actually trying to create parental alienation and you're creating high conflict, right? Similarly, a sexual abuse survivor or a sexual violence survivor who has now impact of trauma, her memory is not all there, she cannot describe everything like a movie scene, she's seen as not to be trusted, not to be reliable, right? So I've gave you 3 different examples of 3 different situations. And what really is actually happening, that the access to justice is becoming an obstacle because they are not trusted. And the slogans that we put out there, we believe survivors, unfortunately have become slogans. Because the system, as it is repairing itself, designing itself, transforming itself, keeps on repeating the same thing. The system is not capable of doing the deep self-reflection and say, where are we wrong in creating these assumptions and biases? So anti-bias training keeps changing its word. We started with anti-oppression. Let's do anti-oppression, anti-racism. Everyone will do anti-oppression, anti-racism, anti-oppression, anti-racism. It'll be like, oh, that's too much. It's like, we have to talk about racism all the time. Let's call it trauma-informed. Now we can be comfortable. Racism can be on the side, comfortable. Trauma-informed, 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 right? But we keep on repeating ourselves though, right? The system keeps on doing the same thing all over again, and we keep on creating these laws in the name of the same people we harm.
Yeah.
That's the tragedy of the designing of these laws, right? Because if you were actually genuinely wanting to protect people, so the best one is the BC-12, I said Bill C-12. I don't know how many of you read the original name. I think they've changed the name now. But the original name was Securing Canadian Borders.
Yes, I think it's similar still.
Right?
Yeah.
But that is the original.
Strong Border Act.
Strong Border Act. I'm like, wow, like whose borders, from whom, who are we protecting, right? I don't know how many of you remember Zero Tolerance Against Barbaric Cultural Practices Act,
Yes.
right? Right? So in terms of, and this is 2026, right? In a colonial world that we live in, and Canada being the project that it has been, it is really interesting for me that how we actually do believe in law. We are the highest regulated society. I think pretty much everyone in this room probably has one or the other kind of regulation in their life. I'm like a lawyer, so of course I'm highly regulated. But in this regulated economy and regulated society that we live in, we have such problem with a basic tenet that can we actually design it for people who are going to use it. So we want customer service for everything. Phone, water bottle, laptop, everything should have customer service. God forbid if we ask for customer service and access to justice. Right? The same quality of respect, dignity, and safety. That's all we are asking. Just treat me well. Treat me like a human. So that's where I leave my barriers. I'll end my every
Thanks, Deepa. I think that what you're talking about really resonates because it's also getting at a kind of another system. So we talked about patriarchy, of course. We've talked about the rugged individualism that comes with consumeristic capitalism, imperial capitalism, and how it's rolled into. We've talked about colonialism and all of that good stuff. So all part of the picture here, and I think it's clear now, as it's probably been clear to a lot of us who work in these spaces, that our criminal justice system, the way it's set up now, is not functioning like a customer service and responsive to the needs of the people it's designed to serve. And kind of harkening back to a point I'd made earlier about sexual violence as the kind of case study example of that is that it is the most underreported crime in Canada. I just wondered if anyone wanted to gander to guess how many on a percentage basis, what percentage of people actually report sexual violence to police?
Less than 5%, depending on this area. Less than 5%.
You knew it, I hear 7, 5, and 6. So, well done. I love this triangulation of our knowledge here in this room. So exactly, it's 6%, and that's a very conservative estimate insofar as it's probably lower, but we should also note that 5% actually goes to charge. So of the ones that actually people go to police to report, it actually only 5% of those actually end up in a charge. So there's lots to discuss there, I think, on the heels of what's already been said. And only 10% of...
Which excludes a trial. A charge is not a trial.
You got it. So actually, to your point, 10% actually result in conviction. So even if it goes through the trial, right? And we're talking, Emily was mentioning about carceral responses and how we're really tough on crime, but if we think that, okay, 6% report, 5% end up in charge, of that 5%, 10% only, like, who is it serving, right? And the question becomes, like, why don't survivors come forward? And I know a lot of it, I'll keep it brief because I feel like a lot of us are in these social justice spaces, but, it can be re-traumatizing, of course, to have to tell your story of experiencing violence. Also, our system, the way it's set up, I mean, if we look at even just the court system itself or entering into a space of police or anything carceral, it's adversarial, right? So that means when it comes to survivors, they have to be the witness to their own victimization, right? And I think someone has mentioned here about trauma impacts on memory, and we're looking at people who've experienced violence who are now being cross-examined to represent themselves. And this can mean having their credibility questioned. It can mean having their counseling notes or having their medical records brought to court, right? So if we even see it coming to a court case, this can mean having some very deeply personal information exposed in court as part of verifying your credibility as a witness to your own crime. That's the victimization. So the other piece that we were just talking about, the one-on-one engagement with our criminal justice system, it's also worth noting that the next layer is our sector, who is set up to not only respond to the violence once it's happened, but also work on the prevention so that it doesn't either happen again for that instance, but so that it doesn't happen, full stop. Ending Sexual Violence Association of Canada, it's in our name, we're supposed to be ending sexual violence, and we're all part of the solution. We'll talk about that. But worth noting is our services that we represent on the ground, it's counseling, right? It's having that trauma-informed, really trauma-informed services, accompaniment. So if you want to go and report, let's say, or you need to go to the hospital or seek medical care, you can have somebody accompany you to ensure that you're getting the supports that you need. That's what this sector is set up to do. But what people don't realize is we are one of the most underfunded sectors in Canada, and sexual violence being one of the lowest across GBV. We have just done an economic impact assessment where we have been able to enumerate that $14.8 billion of cost of the Canadian economy is attributed to sexual violence annually. Yes, well, it's also a huge cost. If we want to talk about smart business, why not invest here? But yet, when we talk to our sector, all of the sexual assault centers across Canada are experiencing huge strain. So I'd mentioned earlier, we're seeing a rise in sexual violence, and we're not seeing the same rise in resourcing to the sector. What that means is that survivors are met with wait times because the services are stretched too thin. 80% of our sector has a wait list, unfortunately, for services. 1/4 of our sector actually has a wait list of 6 months or more. And what that means is if you've experienced sexual violence and you can't afford to pay for your private care, or you want to go somewhere where they're specifically trained and knowledgeable on these kinds of supports, you may have to wait unless we see a dramatic change in the way our system funds this kind of work, right? Also, when we talk about geography, I talked about the 100+ sexual assault centers across our country. We don't have any sexual assault centers in the territories of Canada. Think about who typically are in northern communities as well, right? When we talk about intersectionality and access to resources, we know that the MMIWG National Inquiry has talked about this, Emily has talked about this. You know, when we see that there is no services in some areas and dramatic underfunding, it leads us to think about what is justice? What is access to justice? Who has access to justice? Who can afford it? The last piece is just something that has already been discussed, is about a key barrier being people who have had historical and ongoing negative engagements with our criminal justice system. We can think about policing, we can talk about which groups have had very real reason to be leery of these systems in the first place. We can see why there would be this gap between a rise in sexual violence and a stagnation of those who are actually reporting at 6%, and then the leaky pipe going through to conviction. So it just gives us an example of what we're talking about here in terms of broken systems and justice for whom.
So I just have to say it, it's pretty amazing to be on a panel with such badass women. No, it truly is. You know, when we look at it from a union basis, what is the main barrier? And for us, it's about reporting. It's the ability to report and access justice. And PSAC, we have about 180,000 members who fall under the Canadian federal government. And we defend members who are experiencing harassment every day. And the violence women face does not end when they come to work. It actually follows them. And for some, the workplace itself is a site of harm. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on that. I don't know if you are aware, but a recent Canadian survey found that 94% of workers who reported sexual harassment at work were women, Indigenous, Black, racialized, 2S LGBTQIA+, and workers with disabilities were statistically far more likely to experience harassment. So why are they not choosing to report it? And we hear from our members, they fear retaliation, stigma, or a lack of trust in systems that too often protect those with greater power.
And losing their job.
Very much so, losing their job. Indigenous and racialized women, as well as immigrants, are even more likely to remain silent. And that's the potential fear of discrimination, of being misunderstood because of an accent, judged by language ability, or stereotyped and dismissed because of biases. And I really like what you said about the whole buzzwords changing and the language and anti-oppression, because that's what it is. They think if they repackage something, that all of a sudden it's more palatable. But how is sexual violence or harassment palatable? It's not. So what happens is when women do report, they're forced to relive their trauma, as mentioned before, and they have to access layers of government bureaucracy, management policy and procedure, and often it costs them their credibility and their careers. That's not justice, that's emotional labor. without adequate support or acknowledgement. So far too long, the law itself has reinforced these barriers, whether through caps on compensation for pain and suffering, or through non-disclosure agreements that silence survivors and conceal systemic problems. So justice systems must deliver equitable outcomes for women, but also recognize how race, ethnicity, indigeneity, social, economic status, ability, and other intersecting identities shape women's experiences.
Oh, sorry. Here, I'll bring it over. Thanks. It's a lot to think through, and I was thinking, this repackaging of the language too is really just repackaging injustice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem like, obviously, aside the patriarchy is the biggest obstacle, and it's found ways to keep repackaging this injustice so that we can't really shake it off, even as we try to improve the system. And it seems too like a common theme too is that there's not a lot of resources to be addressing the needs, so we're focusing on the consequences, but not investing in our organizations, in prevention work. That's the systemic sexism that's baked into the system too, that doesn't provide our organizations any support to be doing this work. So how do we solve this? What are some ways that we can, how does your organization advocate and work to eliminate barriers and work towards the systemic change that we need?
So I just want to say that my phone was off, but my daughter and my son are allowed to go through the silence, and so that was my daughter giving me a call, and apparently she's fine. Okay, so there are a few ways that we work to lessen the negative intersectional impacts and improve access to justice, and we work at multiple levels. So there are 22 Elizabeth Fry societies across the country in Canada. There are none in the territories either, which is really sad, and none in Prince Edward Island, although we do some work there anyway. But the 22 local Elizabeth Fry societies provide on-the-ground service provision for criminalized women and gender diverse people, or people who are in danger of becoming criminalized. So housing supports, employment supports, income supports, training, and all of that is done without stigma. Because as I said at the outset, a lot of the people who've experienced criminalization can't access some of the traditional services because of their criminal record, right? And even our Elizabeth Fry societies sometimes have a challenge because, for example, if you have a halfway house is a place where people go legislated to go after prison if they have a condition of being in a residence. And for some folks who have children, they can't be in a halfway house because maybe there's a person who's in that halfway house who has a crime related to harm to children. And you hear that and you think, oh my God, I don't want to know about that person who's harmed a child, but I would like to say that it's all very, very contextual. And we hear these bad things, but we don't actually know what's happened in people's lives until we hear their stories. We also do direct advocacy inside prisons. We go inside the federal prisons every month. We do that with groups of people who are volunteers, many of whom now have been criminalized themselves. So we're actually actively recruiting people who are criminalized to go back into the prison. It's tough to do that. It's pretty hard to go back inside if you were there for a sentence, but lots of people are committed to doing that. And then when we go inside, we also train people inside to be peer advocates. So we train people to understand the laws that affect their work, the Charter, the Human Rights Code, and the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, which has lots of grievances. And so basically, they are learning how to do really good advocacy on their own behalf. And many of them know what it's like to file a grievance and to to understand how to work within a bureaucratic system. So when they come out, they've got all these employment-ready skills. We also work to challenge discriminatory laws and practices, like I said, and I want to give you a really quick example of this. So dry celling is a technique that is used inside prisons to try to get contraband from inside a person's body. So if Correctional Service of Canada suspects that you have something that you inside your body, they're going to put you into a cell that's lit 24/7 and where someone is watching you through plastic or like a window, let's say. Often you don't have clothes on, and every time you go to the bathroom you have to lift up your hands like this and someone watches you while you go to the bathroom. And so the way that the legislation was drafted was you are in the dry cell until the contraband is expelled from your body. So if you have a vagina or a vaginal cavity, you know that contraband is not going to be expelled from your body in the same way that it would be if it was in your anal cavity. Sorry to be so graphic. And so there was a woman that we were working with who was in a dry cell in Nova Scotia, and she was in there for 16 days because they suspected that she had something in her vaginal cavity. And we were doing a ton of advocacy during those 16 days with the warden, who was a man, by the way, at the time. Not to say that all men are bad, but this one was particularly bad. And you know, we were doing advocacy at the national level as well. And we were saying, get this woman out of these torturous conditions. Can you imagine 24/7 being with lights on, somebody watching you for every move? You have nothing to do in this tiny little cell, by the way. It's tiny. You can't watch TV. You can't call your friend.
What about blankets?
Sometimes they give you blankets, but they're like blankets that you can't rip. And she also had a lot of mental health considerations. So over time, and she will tell you this, if you look her up, her name is Lisa Adams. She will say this in her own voice in many CBC interviews, that she started hallucinating. She had a complete mental break. And the only way that she was let out of her dry cell is because the doctor said, oh, I have to do an internal exam because I need to just make sure that everything is okay down there. And the doctor did the internal exam and then wrote, and I do not see any foreign objects located in her vaginal cavity, and that's how they let her out. And so Lisa Adams and her lawyers, who were from Elizabeth Fry in Nova Scotia, went to court and challenged that law, and the judge, who was a very conservative judge, said actually this piece of that legislation is unconstitutional. And so I'm striking it, and the government has 6 months to replace that language. And so then it went up to the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies to work with Justice, to work with the folks who are drafting the new legislation to say, okay, how are we going to replace this? Of course, I'm sure it's no surprise to you that the legislation was not drafted exactly the way we wanted it to be drafted. But at least we got somewhere, and now you can no longer be dry celled if they suspect that you have something in your vaginal cavity. Now, that's not to say CSC, Correctional Service of Canada, won't say, well, we suspect it's in the anal cavity, we're going to dry cell you anyway. But still, these are the kinds of ways that we make change, and it's incremental, but it was huge for Lisa Adams, who was able to use her voice to make that change. And to get back, so one of the things that we were able to do was get her an apology. So we did get her an apology for that, and that was really what she wanted more than anything else. It didn't matter to her. The apology? It took a few years. Yeah, it took a few years. And then we also advanced decarceration and community-based supports. We talk a lot about that in our work. How can we prevent criminalization in the first place? Decarceration is, trying to figure out how we can get people out of prison as fast as possible. The least restrictive measures, how can they do their time and get out? Or how can we make sure that they have alternatives to incarceration? And there's a lot of talk around indigenization of prisons because there's so many Indigenous people in prisons, and how we should be offering Indigenous programming inside, which is like, okay, that's great, but why do we have so many Indigenous people here in the first place? We could be investing that money somewhere else. Also, I said we center lived experience and intersectional feminist analysis in everything that we do. Our advocacy is grounded in solidarity with those who are directly impacted. I brought my earrings from the prisons. I buy earrings every time I go. So this is a little piece of the person who made them, who is incarcerated still, who I know very well, who has come along with us to the UN. And finally, we do international human rights advocacy like this. So we go to the CSW, we use other international mechanisms to try to get the voice of criminalized people into the recommendations that are made. And I want to just say, I can't believe you're all still awake in this very warm environment. Thank you for staying with us. Here you go.
I agree, it is really warm in this room.
Yeah.
So in terms of what do we do at the Schiffler Clinic, and I first wanted to just very quickly reflect on the challenges in the services and the service sector, and I recently, in another panel like this, I kind of said that, you know, the clinics, one of the clinics' core competency is that we are required to be self-reflective. So self-reflection is part of the clinic's mandate. And if the sector had to be really self-reflective about what we do in terms of the service delivery that happens, it is really interesting how much harm we land up causing to people once they interact with the system, which is service delivery system. And I know it's really problematic because it can be like, oh my God, what are you saying? No, we are here for all the good purposes. We are. And we try to do all our best, but the reality is that the sector is not funded for the number of people who want to access the system, and therefore it is running in a deficit all the time. And when you're chronically deficit all the time, what would really happen is exactly what you were talking about. And I do feel that that we have done a lot of case of supports and a lot of buzzwords, but that is probably one of the analysis that we need to talk about. And we need to bring it to people who make decisions around funding and how the structures are funded and who is funded and how and why. I think those questions definitely, as part of the analysis, need to be brought forward, because if you are designing services which are constantly putting people on wait list, then they are not actually equipped to provide the services that they're required to provide. And if that's what you're designing and that's what you're funding, then there is something inherently wrong with your design. Speaking of that, there are two examples that I'll give you from the clinic. Which one is that at the clinic we have a process what is called community engagement working groups. So whatever we design for our policy, our projects, our emerging needs, we actually work with the survivors, but not in that brain mining way where we want them to come and give us their advice. We actually create a working group where working groups actually meet for 15 to 20 sessions, and they actually design the direction of the projects that we run at the clinic. And they are partners on that designing with us, and we do it in a way that they actually get compensated for their time, they actually can question what is happening, they can co-design, celebrate, and become part of the community that deserve to be. And in the process get a lot of peer support from each other, because they can now see each other in the reflections and the experiences that they share. The other thing that I'm really proud of that we were able to do, this is more recently, and we do a lot of interventions work, we do a lot of fund work, we do a lot of coalition building. Every bill that Emily and I were talking about, we probably have done submissions on each and every bill. You can go on our website and see our submissions. We are like broken records. We pretty much say the same thing every time. We have decided that we will not change our position. Independent legal advice for sexual assault survivors is one service that I feel like we have been very recently. It's been only 1 year. So in Ontario, where I come from, there was a roster of lawyers which was providing this service. That roster was completely clogged and the system was not necessarily working. And we took over that roster from the province and completely revamped it, opened it. There are 35 people who are openly available on our website. Who are these 35 people? You can actually see their names right there. We train them. They're all compulsory required to do trauma-informed tutoring training, which has a lot of anti-racism in it. And anti-oppression in it, in the curriculum. They are required to do those trainings, and there is a mandate that has been reset for this list to be completely redone and opened. What is the benefit of that? There is a lot of transparency that has built into the system. I have my colleague here who actually manages the intake and assessment side of that thing, Paula. And we basically have been able to revamp that service. And this has often happened only in 1 year. It's still work in progress. And anyone who knows me know this, that I always say we can be a masterpiece at the end, but we're work in progress till that happens. So it is a work in progress, it is happening, but the fact that we could take something that was clogging and people were not knowing how many hours of service can we get, how do we get it, who are the people we can get the service from, and built in so much transparency into that system, I feel very proud of and sharing with you. Another thing that I would want you to watch out and look for is that the clinic is intervening in a case called Huck. It is going to Supreme Court. It is against Bill 21, where women who wear niqab are not able to access public services in Quebec. And clinic is bringing a very unique intervention in that case. We are bringing a perspective of women who wear niqab who are lawyers, and why women wearing niqab should be able to access them as their lawyers when they are being represented. And the choice of your counsel, the choice of your lawyer as a Section 15 argument is what we are proceeding with in that case. So lots of good stuff, but I can keep on and on, but that's a few things. But you know, thinking about all the good stuff that we all do, the reality is there is more needed, and the chronically underfunding is something I think I can talk till cows come home, as they speak, and everything needs a resource. If money could just actually sit on the table and do the work, the money would do the work. The reality is that money needs to be given to people for whom to do the work till they actually figure out how AI can do everything for them.
Being really brief in terms of how we work toward solutions. So I had mentioned that Ending Sexual Violence Association of Canada really kind of came out in the last year as having our refined mandate. We were Ending Violence Association, now we're Ending Sexual Violence. But really the movement behind the work that we do started in the 70s with a bunch of badass women who decided that enough is enough. We need to address sexual violence in our communities because no one else is. So they set up volunteer-run sexual assault centers and crisis centers, which started to move into different spaces across our communities. Then we started to get more infrastructure and have provincial territorial associations who were able to work as liaisons between the community organizations and the provincial government and provincial level decision making. ESPA Canada grew out of the momentum that we've had because of these women, these folks who are on the ground doing this good work, and in the last year we now finally have a national voice on sexual violence in 2025 in Canada. What this speaks to is our very first strategic plan. Our 3 pillars is align, amplify, and build. We're aligning the sector. We are amplifying the voices of survivors and those directly impacted, our communities, the people who work in our space, the people who are burning out because there isn't enough support. Building the infrastructure, we talk about legislative changes. ESPA Canada is strategically positioned to not only work with its members and their members to be able to hear the voices on the ground, but also ensure that those are coming through to conversations around legislation, around funding. This means that we are in that continuous loop with each other, working in relationship with each other. It also means working with this other group of badass women. Many of you represent those people who we work with laterally at the national level to say enough is enough. We're looking at different sides of the same coin of patriarchy, of rugged pursuit of capital, drill baby drill, over incarceration of people in our communities who have not had access to resources and continue to be marginalized. So this kind of deep intersectional and intersectoral work that we're doing together is where we see an end to sexual violence. And also adding to that layer now as our very first time at the CSW, which is a privilege and an honor to be in community here with you, is pulling now on the international space. It is these levels that we're all working in concert, that when working together coordinated, we are able to challenge those systems and see an end in Canada and hopefully globally to sexual violence, to gender-based violence, and hopefully to all forms of violence. So, thank you.
So PSAC has long fought to make justice more accessible. And the way we do it is, I like to say that we're very creative. Because not only do we have legislation, but we have collective agreements, and we do political action and public advocacy. And between those three different pieces, we figure out a way to shape it. Because if you can collectively bargain it and put in an agreement, then you can do it. We have over 300 bargaining units, and we can create a wave of movement. If you get it federally, you can get it provincially and territorially. If you can get it territorially, well, it's keeping pace provincially and federally. And so for us, we're working to create safer workplaces and to ensure that people who experience harassment or discrimination receive real support. So one of our proudest victories is winning 10 days of paid domestic violence leave in our collective agreements and across federally regulated workplaces. And so I just wanna, and it would be remiss of me not to say this, but oftentimes it's stated that women experience domestic violence. But let's be real here, it's partner violence, right? And we need to recognize that. The other thing that we do is, as we're moving forward with our collective bargaining, we recognize our privilege, our political privilege of the sheer number of members we represent, the lobbying that we do, and how we lend our voice politically to different issues. And so we recognize as well that that work, that being a good ally, sometimes what does that look like? It requires sometimes funding, because we do fund really progressive, good organizations who are not able to access mainstream funding because of cuts. But we also are member driven, so it's our members who are shaping what our agenda is. And an example of that is women at a recent conference decided, you know what? Union money should not be spent on alcohol, right? And so that is something that's going to be moving forward for further debate. And it's about shifting the culture of what safety looks like for everyone, and how do we be more inclusive. And another example is we recognize Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people remain 4 times more likely to be victims of violence. And so when authorities refuse to search the landfills for the remains of Ashley Shingoose, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Rebecca Comtois, it sent a message that Indigenous women's lives do not matter. And our members passed a resolution to support the searching of the landfills. And so, we wanted to make it clear Indigenous women and girls are not disposable. And so we put pressure on the federal government, provincial governments, and territorial governments in regards to making sure that their work that they're doing is centered around Indigenous women and girls, two-spirited people, through culturally grounded, trauma-informed approaches, and to end violence against Indigenous women and girls. And so, what happens next? Well, we also have members who work at women's shelters and transition houses across the country. And so we are fighting to keep these spaces open and for funding to continue. And I can tell you, it's a very difficult fight right now. Very difficult fight. the strained resources, the conditions our members work under, and we recognize who their clients are, who patrons these facilities, and how we work hand in hand. And so we want to make sure that there are tools there that are available, but there's also a level of healing, and it's culturally appropriate healing. So we know we have a lot of work to do internally, externally, but it's about building that community. And I truly believe that when community works together, we move further ahead. And if we want to be the Canada that we hear a lot about elbows up, we hear a lot about our healthcare system, but our healthcare system is dying. And now we have to rethink, what are we proud of? And are we really financing and putting the resources to where it needs to be? And if unionized workers are able to get this, why can't everyone have access to it? So I will say, let's change this culture. Let's make sure that the next generation of women and girls have it better than us.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions for the panelists. The mic's up here, or it might be better with the mic, or how do you want to manage it?
Bring one of these?
Yeah, bring that around. Okay.
Thank you so much to the panel, and I think it's a really good wake-up call for all Canadians to listen to each of your perspectives on the state of women in 2026. And I want to pick up where, can you hear me?
Yes, it's just there's some side chatter. I apologize.
I just want to pick up where Sharon left off, because that's what I was thinking as you were speaking. Bell Hooks said, just burn the damn thing down. Yeah. And if you could intervene in your respective areas, what would you choose to do so that the next generation does not have to face this? And money is not what we're talking about here. Because I believe that we can build those systems. So what would you do? Sharon?
So there's two pieces I'm gonna say. First, through my experience of activism, I started as a young worker. Like, I was 26 when I got involved in the union. And I got involved because the job that I had, they were going by list, and I was in a position of precarious employment. And at the time, I was working for 7 years with 3-month contracts. And I was promised an indeterminate position, and at the time the list ran out, and so I was back to that precarious position, and they were eliminating full-time employment. So either I become a part-time worker or drop 6 levels in pay. So I chose to drop 6 levels in pay and join the union, because I didn't believe anyone should go through this in a unionized environment. And so that's what motivated me. In terms of waving a magic wand and making anything possible, first of all, I would say that we need to take a serious look at every piece of legislation and how they interact and the limitations. Because I will tell you that there is, when there's political will, things move fast in the government, federally, provincially, territorially. Things just move because there's that political will. So I would love to see political will to protecting, those from marginalized communities, especially women and girls with intersectional identities. Have that political will, because all of a sudden, and I'm just going to use an example, is during the pandemic, the government found money to put money in people's pockets. So where did that money come from? It didn't magically appear. So everything is a possibility, everything. Where's the political will? And where's the vision? If we're talking about looking at, and I'm speaking specifically of Canada, and I'm also gonna say internationally, because right now, with all the conflicts that are occurring, who's suffering? It's women and girls. And so if the world valued women and girls, we would be looking at these conflicts, would be looking at our priorities a little bit differently, right?
Yeah, how do we have money for war?
Exactly, exactly.
What would you do, Candace?
Oh, thank you.
She's asking all of us.
Yeah,
Okay.
she's asking that one thing from each person.
Yeah.
I'll be brief and just say that finding our commonality as women, as gender diverse individuals, so briefly, feminist movements have shifted and evolved, and for various reasons, we've moved into what we're calling now sectors, right? Because it's been professionalized for very valid reasons. But I believe that we've lost movement-based work. And what I mean by that, and we've seen shifts in like more third wave feminism where it's very individualized, and there's reasons for that. But I think we're at a point now where we're talking about our unique positionalities in the complex web of intersectionality, where we need to recognize those who have different access to resources, and that's power, that's influence, but also still able to find that common element. A lot of what we're talking about here is dismantling patriarchy. What form does patriarchy take? We see it in a lot of our capitalist consumption habits. We see it in the competitiveness, individualism. Women have historically been the keepers of social tie and community. We have this capacity. We need to work together. So if I could change one thing or inspire one thing, is let's have those conversations. Let's have those concerted actions. Let's align, amplify, and build our movements again today, knowing what we know we've done for generations, but from a new wisdom that's embedded in today, understanding where women have been at the margins, but they bring this epistemic privilege of being able to know what it is to have been excluded. Let's talk to those people, bring them in, let's share the table.
I know you asked for one thing, but I'll give you three. Very quickly. Give status to all women and gender diverse people who are experiencing violence just because of one reason, because they have a precarious immigration status. Start with believing that, give them status, you can do your scrutiny later on, as you do with your income tax, right? Yeah, audit, when you need to. Two, give people choices in the justice system. As I said, bring customer services to the justice system, give people choices and options. Not everyone wants people to be put behind bars. Not everyone wants to have high conflict litigation. Not everyone has resources or emotional wealth for that, right? Real and emotional both. Give people choices, have restorative justice system actually be a reality instead of this, like we have been doing research after research and pilots after pilots. Can we just actually start doing it now? And the last, as Emily would say, and she would probably say it in a much better way, can we stop making jails as this, capitalistic structure that exists, rather than thinking about what our criminal justice system's tenet is. This tenet is rehabilitation. We actually stopped capital punishment in Canada for a reason. We were one of the first countries in this world to say we won't have capital punishment. There is a reason behind it. And if the tenet is rehabilitation, can we focus on that and stop criminalizing people? Three things.
You did my job for me. I also want to say there's something in this conversation around Indigenous self-determination, and like we're spending billions of dollars incarcerating people. Why aren't we giving that money to Indigenous communities instead? And there's a lot of work to do there still, but we have lots of pathways. We know what we need to do, so let's just do it. Yeah.
we have time for one more quick question? One more.
Je vais parler en français.
Okay.
Oui, alors, merci beaucoup aux panélistes. C'était vraiment le débat très important, parce que tout le monde comprend. Vous allez...
Je fais la
Oui,
interprétation en même temps.
Oui, ok. Ok, alors, merci. Mais on a parlé de... En même temps qu'on parle de changer de loi, nous allons parler en même temps de l'éducation. Éducation des survivantes et éducation des membres des groupes que nous sommes. Et je vais terminer rapidement par des exemples, parce que c'est la même chose dans tous les pays. Alors, je suis partie en Italie, c'était pour une journée, et je vais aller à la salle de bain, j'ai vu toute une file, une ligne de gens. Alors, je me suis demandé, mais qu'est-ce qui se passe? Pour aller là-bas, pour trouver qu'un homme a quitté les toilettes des hommes, il est venu aux toilettes des femmes, et toutes les femmes regardaient que l'homme quitte. Alors tout le monde a souffert. Moi, qu'est-ce que je suis déformée par la formation canadienne en Italie. Hein. Je suis partie, je suis entrée dans les toilettes et j'ai dit à l'homme, out! Oui. Alors il est sorti malgré qu'il a parlé mal de moi, mais il est sorti. Heureusement, et j'ai permis aux autres femmes d'entrer aux toilettes. Au mois de novembre, j'étais en Tunisie. On était 4 Canadiennes, une Tunisienne. Et à partir de l'avion, il y a une femme qui était avec son mari. Elle les portait, j'ai bien compté. Elle avait 5 bagages. Et le mari avait seulement le bébé. Moi, je regardais tout au long pour voir s'il y a des gens qui vont réagir. Non. Alors, arrivé là où il y avait le bagage, moi j'ai dit à l'homme, regarde, donne le bébé à ta femme et prends le bagage. Et l'homme a pris le bagage, mais qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? La femme s'est fâchée contre moi. De quoi tu te mêles? Bon, il y a beaucoup de travail à faire. Je vous remercie.
Okay, well that brings us right till the end here. I just want to thank everyone on the panel. That was excellent and so much to think about. And thank you to everyone for coming. So we got to get to work smashing the patriarchy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I just say one thing?